Welcome, everybody. This is the MS in Architecture Computational Technologies at the New York Institute of Technology, School of Architecture and Design. And I am Pablo Lorenzo Iroa, the director of the program. And we have here today our keynote lecturer, Biayna Bogosian, who's going to be lecturing on different aspects of the relation between computation and virtual reality. The title of the presentation is Urban Environmental Interfaces. The Master of Science in Architecture Computational Technology is hosting this semester a lecture series that is entitled Informed Actualizations from Artificial Intelligence to Physical Computation. And the lecture series aims at discussing research framed by invited guest speakers, such as Biayna. The MS program focuses on architecture, expanding relations between science, technology, and culture through innovation in algorithms, simulations, AI, robotics, robotic fabrication, and materials. This semester lecture series discusses alternative means to understand the dialectics between the ideal digital and the physical digital. Within an architecture of information, AI, robotics, and materials are thought as actualization interfaces. This process understands information flows and their actualizations as architecture. Biayna Bogosian is an assistant professor of architectural technology at Florida International University and is a PhD candidate in media arts and practice at USC School of Cinematic Arts. Today's presentation is Urban Environmental Interfaces and will focus on how interactive, immersive, and local media can facilitate new methods for researchers, designers, policymakers, and communities to engage with urban environmental information. Through several projects in various cities, this talk will explain the social, spatial, and political dynamics of urban environmental pollutant monitoring and representation using participatory custom hardware and software development. In this context, the speaker will elaborate on the importance of interdisciplinary research and teaching when exploring data-driven and citizen-centric approaches with the aim to improve the health and the built environment. Biayna Bogosian academic and professional background extends in the fields of architecture, computational design, environmental design, data science, spatial computing, and media arts. Biayna's interdisciplinary research has allowed her to understand innovation in design and technology with a broader environmental context and explore data-driven and citizen-centric approaches to improve the built environment. Biayna is currently an assistant professor of architectural technology at Florida International University, where her interdisciplinary research is supported by a number of National Science Foundation grants. She has also taught at Columbia University GSAAPP, Cornell University AAP, University of Southern California School of Architecture, Tongji University CAUP, among other universities. Biayna studied at Columbia University and is currently a PhD candidate in the Media Arts and Practice program at the USC School of Cinematic Art. Welcome, Biayna, and many thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will begin sharing the screen. Thank you very much, Pablo, for the invitation, and I'm very honored to be joining your course, but also I'm very much excited and looking forward to the work that you're doing with the program. So based on my introduction, I would like to also emphasize the interdisciplinary aspect of my background, and the work that I'll be presenting today is mainly focusing on series of investigations that have been conducted in collaborative form that has focused on understanding environmental parameters. The work has mainly been understanding air pollution and water pollution, but I will frame this in the context of data resolution and data accessibility, and how possibly we as designers, media makers, and maybe as curious citizens, we can engage with this conversation. So the main question that drives the research is about understanding nuanced nature of environmental issues. As I'm sure you're aware, as architects, designers, when we are talking about environmental issues, often it's very difficult to pinpoint one specific element. And then the question is always is that once we identify the issues, once we identify really what we should be focusing on, how could we better understand and design with urban environmental data and policy? So the scope of work that I'll be presenting today mainly looks at urban context or urban scale and cities. But the underlying tone here is the fact that once we have enough information from our cities, then we perhaps are able to create better architectures in a plural form. So it's difficult to talk about when we're talking about environmental issues and maybe not start to point out what is currently happening as a larger context of environmental conversation. So it's really important to highlight that there's been a number of efforts throughout the year to really understand not only what is causing environmental issues, but also what type of responses and policies could be put in place. But a lot of studies are pinpointing that a longer, let's say, effort has to really take into account environmental literacy. So perhaps UN Sustainable Development Goal is a representation of this. In a sense, they try to really narrow down the issues and try to communicate that with series of graphics to be able to perhaps simplify and summarize the issues that perhaps they could trigger conversations that would allow you to be able to correlate between them. But here, what I'd like to highlight is the vastness of the issue, but the use of graphic and representation and indexing as a way of trying to understand the vastness of information. However, starting to look at environmental issue and trying to make sense of it is not a new phenomenon. What we're looking at here is a graph called a Keeling curve, which is devised by scientist Charles David Keeling. Charles David Keeling, who was an environmental scientist, started as a researcher at Caltech in Pasadena, began to devise a number of novel sensors and began to monitor CO2 trends since late 1958. And what's fascinating about this graph, this information visualization that has been accumulated over years, is the fact that through many cycles of modern environmental movement, it's been used for or against arguing for environmental issues and concerns. So it's been used by some to argue for implementing policy and by others to try to fight against, let's say, repelling certain policies. So this graph is as political as it gets, and it's very much by many looked at as the birth of modern environmental movement. So what's really important here is to start to think about continuous monitoring, but also short-term and long-term trends and how perhaps beginning to look at information archiving could begin to give us a maybe different understanding of scale of issues that we are dealing with. Obviously, we need to put this in the context of advancements. In 2006, NASA presented the very first high spatiotemporal CO2 mapping, and this was quite important because for the first time we were able to not only perhaps understand the issue as a linear graph, but really understand nuanced nature of environmental parameters and distribution based on urbanization. And this spatialization was quite important. However, when as architects, maybe as architecture students, maybe you're taking a studio focus on sustainability. This is something that I'm dealing with this semester, teaching a sustainability studio. When we are looking at introducing environmental parameters to, let's say, architecture studios, we are relying on tools, that's simulation tools. So here we're looking at Energy Plus data, which is required if you're using a Ladybug or Honeybee plugin. And what this simulation environment is requiring is a series of prepackaged information based on location. So you're based in New York, here we're looking at number of weather stations that's suggested for you to begin to work with. So in this case, as you could see that the entire state of New York has very few suggestions, right? So a lot of these weather stations are placed in locations where it would allow scientists to do high temporal sampling. So these are often referred to as idealized locations, but they are using really expensive devices. So they really want to make sure that it's placed in a way that maybe it's not going to be impacted by vandalization, the sensors will not be stolen, but also it's placed in a way that they're able to do consistent monitoring. However, as you can imagine, placing sensors in an idealized location doesn't really work with, let's say, if you're designing a tower in a specific location, right? So when it comes to looking at a scale of information that would allow you to make decision about your specific building, we are still lacking quite a lot of information resolution. So looking at information resolution, let's say the other end of working with environmental data is fieldwork. As architectural students, we're quite familiar with the process of going to a site and collecting site information. Often we're trained to go to a site, start with taking photographs and doing other type of surveying and documentation. So how can we extend this in a way to maybe better understand also environmental parameters? I was conducting an urban environmental mapping course in a capital city of Armenia in Yerevan, and we were actually interested in looking at relationship of vegetation and environmental pollutants. But what we realized very soon was that we were lacking sufficient GIS layers and information for us to even begin to create these correlations. So instead of actually spending in this case, the studio, creating this correlation, we created a series of tools. In this case, it's a mobile application for students to begin to pretty much walk the entire city and begin to map the tree types, tree trunk with canopies and location of the trees. Now, this is exciting because we were able to contribute to a new GIS layer that could potentially be used by other researchers and scientists. But what was really difficult here was that the entire time of our studio was spent on information collection. So let's say opposite of simulation, if it's fieldwork could often be slow and quite tedious, right? But it gives you the opportunity to contribute to an already existing database. Similar approach was applied to a seminar that I was teaching at SciArc in fall of 2018, where we were interested in mapping relationship of, in this case, CO2 and the tree location. And again, we were lacking information for us to begin to create this correlation. And we began to look into not only collecting information from site, but then creating a dashboard where it would allow us to correlate information. So if as architects, as designers, as let's say media makers, we're used to working with different views, how can we begin to combine them where quickly it would give us a general understanding of what information means in a specific location. So we're starting to look at how information could become more spatiotemporal, but also we can begin to use different views and different type of annotation to begin to look at correlation. So by looking at here a few different types of sensing, in 2014, my colleague Maider Yaguna and I, we began to look at information in the context of relationship of sensor and the object that is being sensed. And we created these 4 categories by the virtue of whether an object was local or it was remote. So whether we were doing the sensing in that specific spot or we were doing remote sensing, and whether we were looking at a static sensing or a mobile sensing. So for instance, when we're looking at the weather station, that's an example of a local static sensing. We devised this categorization in order for us to begin to understand the pros and cons of each of these methods. So for instance, if we're looking at the weather station example, devising this could be costly. It would require experts to run this. However, it will give you high temporal resolution. However, it would lack spatiality, right? Because you're able to only sample very few locations. But if we look at the example of the walking that we did in city of Yerevan or with SciArt students, that would be more of an example of local mobile sensing. So in this case, you can walk, you can bike, you can attach sensor to your cars, or you can skateboard, and you're able to cover a larger territory indeed. However, you are not able to collect the sampling of the same location multiple times, right? So you're able to cover a larger spatial territory, however, it's lacking temporality. But the exciting part of looking at local mobile sensing is the fact that if you're able to engage other citizens, or let's say stakeholders, you're able to, through iteration, build in this case, a database that ultimately, through refinement of information, interpolation, you're able to create a larger database. Now, in terms of problem of information representation, this was a number of, this was a study we did in 2017 when we were doing a research for Seoul Biennial, which I'll be sharing earlier with my colleague, Yaguna, and we were looking at state-of-the-art air quality apps. We were very much curious about the graphic quality and representation aspects of these apps, and we started to see that a lot of them are using very large numbers to communicate a specific value. So let's say here we're looking at number 10, here we're looking at 35. But what becomes really difficult to understand is whether a number is good or bad within a specific range. So is 35 good? Is 52 good? What about number 10? And we realized that often these apps are relying on their own formula for coming up with the index. Sometimes they do show the range, but ultimately a lot has been put back on the citizen or on the curious person for engaging with this information. And it's very much the same when you're running a simulation, right? So often you're working with a black box and it becomes difficult to know what are the variables that you have control over versus what is it that is being applied to your system and taught that way. So maybe opposite of this is a model which was proposed by John Tukey, who was a statistician teaching at Stanford, which in 1970 proposed this thing called Expiratory Data Analysis, or EDA. What was exciting about John Tukey's proposal, and as I'm sure you know that statistics is basically foundation of our artificial intelligence, machine learning, is the fact that he was looking at for ways that he can communicate to scientists that to start to engage with information in a different way. So what he proposed with EDA system was to not begin with the typical hypothesis, which is very much a foundation of scientific method, but really start to be immersed in information and spend time looking at information. And over time, through let's say identification of patterns, one then begin to formulate a hypothesis that's very much based on updating of this information. So this is quite important in this sense. It suggests that perhaps immersion in information and allowing one to experience the information, maybe spatially, maybe temporally, has the possibility to allow for new patterns to be emerged. So based on that, for the past almost 8-9 years, I have, with a number of collaborators, conducted series of experiments that are starting to look at how environmental information, environmental data could be acquired, could be visualized, but also could allow experiencing information through participation and through sharing of information. This is a typical workflow that, let's say, I will be interested in devising, and different project that I'll be sharing today will have maybe strength in certain aspect of this. But the idea is to begin to really think about the audience. So who are the audience? Is it citizens? Is it policymakers? Is it stakeholders? Is it designers? And look for ways that information can be collected, whether this is an information that's already shared with you, information that you'll be collecting, then what will be the sensors? What will be the hardware incorporated with the this? What will be the software incorporated with this? And can we as architects and designer perhaps learn enough to be able to create our own custom information collection kits? Then how can information visualization assist us in the process of not only experimentation, devising experiments, but also we can contribute to conversations that scientists and policymakers are starting to have with the information. And at the end, how could this lead to design and also policy change? So these are very, very large and ambitious questions to address, but ultimately there's a curiosity in understanding the sociospatial and political dynamics of working with environmental data, and possibly how by accessing higher resolution information, we can begin to devise better workflows and make better decisions. As we know, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to addressing environmental issues. So I'm going to start with a very simple experiment or early experiments, and I'm going to build up towards how that's translated to the work that I'm doing here in Miami. So if you're not familiar with Los Angeles has a very complicated relationship to air quality. The first Clean Air Act was passed in Los Angeles, and let's say this, the smog check that you have to do with your car, it was due to the fact that Los Angeles as the first or one of the early, let's say suburban or cities that dealt with sprawl, was dealing with smog in a very severe way. So therefore they had to be this law passed for you to do a smog check, and therefore it led to the Clean Air Act. In Los Angeles, air quality is something that often the citizens are dealing with daily. And while I was studying at University of Southern California, which is set up right in the heart of the pollution west of the downtown, it only makes sense for me to begin to experiment with it. So I was very much interested in looking for sensors that would allow us to create sensing kits that could be duplicated as many times as possible. So working with my colleague Marty Yaguno, we began to create series of sensing kits, and over the time we were looking at a relationship of costs to information resolution and relationship of the visualization that we're getting to then the boxes that we're designing. So this box that you will be seeing here was generated in a way that we could do many different versions and iteration with it. So this was designed for you to be able to attach a camera. Here you can also attach your phone. You can add a thermal camera. You can also flip it to connect to a drone. So this way we could do different types of sensing. The very, very first version we did, it was actually a container that we put together, but then we were able to look at the data in real time. And then as part of actually a hackathon that we were working on during Arcadia 2014, with a group, we created this series of experiments where we had participants that volunteered to bike around campus, and we were able to look at their information, in this case only temperature difference. And what was exciting in this, we actually realized, well, maybe temperature alone is not interesting to look at. Then we began to look at, well, what if we look at other state-of-the-art tools? So what if we take MATLAB and not only we plot the information, but we begin to torque it based on variation? But then we begin to really be interested in the camera component of this. And my background in media arts was very much interested in the first view aspect. So as architects, we think about maybe an aerial view, a first person perspective. So we thought to really invest in this first person view, and very much kind of also inspired by the way that in game design and interaction design, the view of the observer becomes really, really primary. So we took the information we had gathered and we created an algorithm for filtering this information. So there's two parameters here. There's color temperature. So blue means less cooler and red means warmer. And pixelation is connected with CO2 levels. So here we are with a bike, we're exiting the campus. Obviously this is sped up for us to be able to see this. We're going more towards the freeway, and you can start to see how pixels are becoming larger, right? So CO2 is increasing. At the same time, the color is not a linear relationship. So we're starting to see that perhaps while pixels are increasing and decreasing, color is also changing. So it's not always a linear relationship here between CO2 and temperature. And this was for us very interesting because just by tweaking these two parameters, we were able to do some general correlation. So for instance, in the upper left corner, we're seeing a typical courtyard surrounded by trees, a good combination of pervious and impervious surfaces, and you can begin to think about this relationship of color to temperature versus pixelation. So the color is cooler, and also there's less CO2. Well, that makes sense. That's typically how we would think about maybe a public green space. However, we're starting to see how we're going more towards the edges of the campus. So if we look at this as a linear kind of a story through the right, you can see that pixels are increasing or decreasing, but it's not always a linear relationship. So for us, that was an interesting finding, but also people really began to respond to these two parameters. It was easy for our audience to understand the relationship or the nuanced nature of the relationship. And at the same time, we were very much interested in understanding the space in 3 dimensions. So we devised a number of drone readings on campus. So here we're looking at a vertical reading of a campus, one of the main buildings on campus. And we thought, well, what if we also couple the plotting of the information on the side? So as the audience is trying to understand what the visualization is trying to do, in this case, you see a clear relationship, more of a linear relationship between CO2 and temperature versus, let's say, the horizontal, right? Well, what's great about working with drones is the fact that you can definitely program the vertical elevation, and you're able to also do 2 readings at a time. And we saw a lot of interesting response with this specific visualization. People communicated with us that it was they felt a sense of release when the drone. I'm gonna play this again. We did multiple buildings. When you're starting to see the elevation changing and the pixelation size is changing, also you're starting to understand perhaps pollution that could be also this type of visualization could also invoke emotions in the audience. So here we're very much interested in the relationship of the representation of data, but also the relationship of the emotion and the empathy that could kind of arise in our audience. After doing a series of parameterization, one very interesting finding about the campus was we were able to locate the most polluted area on campus, which was this upper north corner, so the northeast corner of the campus. And what's fascinating about this is the fact that after looking at surface types, but also vegetation, we begin to think about the duration of traffic lights and realize that actually in this specific spot, traffic light is the longest, and it makes sense when you have a long duration of a traffic light, cars are beginning to idle, you have accumulation of gases, and you're starting to then create high density of pollution. But this was an important point for us because we began to think about, well, this is something that perhaps no matter what architect or urban planners do, with a number of maybe trees that we can plant, with the materials that we can use, if we don't have a direct relationship with the city in a sense of exchanging information about, in this case, pollution and duration of light, then we're never going to be able to really close the gap, right? So this is exciting because I was able to present this to the provost of campus, and I was told that they were going to communicate this with the city. For us, this was a quite important moment in terms of understanding role of information visualization and policy. So the same kind of sensing kit and versions of this were created. In this case, we're looking at 2 digital future workshops that we did in 2017 and 2018. We were very much interested in the DIY, but also DIW, which is do it with others model. So really doing quick, assembling and disassembling using horizontal and vertical methods of sensing. You saw, for instance, a scooter, you saw a backpack version for walking. It allowed us to really understand some of the possibilities of information acquisition and visualization. And what's interesting about working in a place like Tongji University, we had to get really clever in terms of how we were exchanging information in real time, and then begin to think about how that information fit into augmented reality and virtual reality. So what we're seeing right now is a scale model of Tongji campus, and the pollution points are plotted as these layers that one can turn on and off. So this is using HTC Vive, and here you can see actually that somebody was putting their head in the environment. Now you're seeing the replica of the same drone we saw earlier. So here we're talking about potential of also controlling the drone or robots from virtual reality, and then beginning to overlay simulation layers over, in this case, a digital twin of Tongji University. So really start to understand information in a spatial way, but also how this combination between digital and physical could have possibility of maybe rethinking how we're looking at information exchange, but also relationship of morphology and pollution information. In this case, my colleague Biayna was a postdoc at Princeton University, so we joined forces with her advisor and my advisor, Professor Scott Fisher, to put a proposal forward for an innovation grant at Princeton University, which allowed us to create a project for 2017 so biennial, where this idea of looking at a low-cost sensor could be taken much further. So these devices were developed at Princeton University, and here we looked at really how we could upgrade the sensors in a way that we could still make it reproducible. However, we could really start to look at calibration. So with the help of Biayna's advisor, Professor Elie Bouzid, we were able to learn quite a lot about the kind of this really interesting threshold between cost and calibration of sensors. And this was a quite interesting challenge. Also, we were using an IoT microcontroller to send the information in real time to our server, to then that information could be presented. So this unit was solar powered, and we learned quite a lot working in a city which was cloudier than one we anticipated. So it was quite interesting to really understand. But what's important here is the fact that Seoul or Korea is a place where for many years blamed its pollution issues on China. But for 2017, the mayor had just been elected, and one of the pitches for the mayor to be elected was the fact that he was going to invest in understanding the root of the pollution issue. So we were able to actually start a conversation with the city, and in this case, as you can see, we had to start a conversation with public transportation in order for us to be able to have access to the buses to be able to access that. So we had a number of visualizations in the space. You saw the website version. So that was a website that was being updated in real time. This was very much inspired by the work that we've done at USC, looking at filtering, so representation of color as a way to quickly let you know whether we were having a good day or a bad day. So this tapped into the nearest weather stations or the nearest sensing kit, and it gave you a general overview. At the same time, most of our time was spent on this, let's say, immersive augmented reality component, which was mobile-based. So we got access, let's say, after 6 months of back and forth to 30 years of weather station data. And with the weather station data, we were able to really look into how we can create an archival visualization where it allows people to understand pollution as number of pollution clouds over the city. Now, it's very difficult to represent augmented reality and virtual reality over screen with captured video. But this allowed the participants to use these series of tablets and walk over the city and distribute, which is distributed into 25 districts, and understand it based on either archival information and based on the specific parameter, or tap into real-time information. And for us, this was a very large learning challenge to not only work with officials to have access to archival information, but also get around all the, let's say, security issues of working with real-time information. So we learned quite a lot, and it was exciting to see a range of people that were engaged with this. So that led to a recent project, which was very much inspired by how would, let's say, Niantic's Pokemon Go model could possibly be turned into, in this case, an air quality related app. So this was done pre-COVID. Unfortunately, the development has stopped, but we're excited to pick it up soon. So we had a number of sensors, worked with an IoT center at USC School of Engineering to set up these air quality sensors around campus. And the app allowed participants to discover. So you see an arrow here. So it basically guides you to the nearest sensor location. And it allows you to pretty much also use your student ID to take a look at a larger position of these sensors. So these were the sensors that we were capturing information. And at the same time, it gave you a first-person view of where the location was. So it would allow you to find the sensors better, but then it also gave you a weekly average of the readings. So we were very excited to develop this. The later iteration allowed you to plot trees, and if you were basically finding a sensor box, you had points to plant trees, reduce the CO2 emission, and they were very much excited to pick this up after finally the school is back to normal. So after I joined my position here in Miami, I was very much interested in continuing these efforts, but looked at issues of water pollution and sea level rise in a city like Miami. So Miami is a city that's very much constructed on shallow geologic formation. So when it rains and it floods, because of also the rapid nature of the city, these type of scenes are extremely common. So for the past few years, we've been working with an Institute of Environment here to create a number of citizen science efforts that allows us to kind of go beyond what is currently being done. So currently, the Institute of Environment here in Florida International University, where I'm teaching, the series of citizen science initiatives where it calls for people to measure the flooding in their neighborhood. And then people are recording this and sending this. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of imprecision, right, in this process. So what we've created is a device that allows you to, with a number of different sensors, do an accurate reading, and then that's communicating with a mobile app, and that information is stored in our server, and it could be accessed. So we're looking at a typical sensor that currently the Institute is using for doing water pollution monitoring. So it's really important for us to work with a depth sensor. As you can imagine, we need to know our locations, but let's say a series of parameters such as turbidity, which it gives you a general quality of water, and then conductivity, which conductivity sensors and salinity sensors are it's basically the same parameter depending on how you define it. And that is really important parameter for us in Miami, because when you're measuring salinity, it allows you to understand the relationship of fresh water and seawater. So with that, we're able to understand whether there's sewage issues, sewage leakage, and there's other parameters here as well. So we have gone through many different iterations of this. And I'm gonna go ahead, and this is our latest iteration, which allows you to, in a general sense, do the reading. So we're hoping to finish this and apply this in the coming months, and looking forward to kind of documenting the effort. At the same time, kind of bringing what we learned from the city of Seoul to Miami and issue of sea level rise is quite important. So what you're looking at here is a project that's actually very much still work in progress. And today we were visited by the head of the institute, and we're hoping to basically create something for the next weeks that could be presented to the mayor of Miami. And here, what you're looking at, I'm going to go to the next slide to show you a general overview, is we are able to take the NOAA's sea level rise values, and we're able to just simulate this with a number of other parameters along with the pollution using HoloLens. HoloLens is great because it basically has quite a lot of computing power compared to the previous augmented reality equivalents, but it also allows you to work with real world objects. So here we're devising series of basically tokens on this surface that you could also work with this. So we're looking forward to presenting this in the next few weeks. At the same time, I'm gonna skip ahead and I'm gonna show you other type of work that we do here in terms of visualization. So what is really interesting is looking at information beyond architecture is the fact that I was never aware of cycle of nature and seasons. And here, something that's quite fascinating working in Miami is the fact that depending on pollution, we're starting to see certain trends. Unfortunately, every August since I've been here in the past few years, we see a very high increase in surfacing of dead fish in the surface. And this is a kind of a term that people that living in the city are quite familiar with, the August fish kill. And specifically, it's been really heightened in the past few years. So what we're looking at here is a website which has been devised by an interdisciplinary collaboration between architecture students and computer science students that I'm very fortunate to work with. And we're looking at here the process of the data collection from the bay. So similar to the information I showed earlier about weather stations, when it comes to water sampling, also this information is extremely scarce. So when you do have an emergency, such as say tens of thousands of dead fish are appearing along the shore, there is citizen science, but also scientists that are using emergency boats and emergency sensors to do, again, mobile sensing. Here we're looking at a graph of the information that we're sensing, but like a roller coaster. So this is part of a virtual reality roller coaster data that we're developing, but also looking at information with an overlay is quite fascinating. So here we're looking at the values that were gathered by the scientists using their mobile sensors. And the most important parameter here to look at is the relationship between dissolved oxygen and temperature. So dissolved oxygen and temperature have an inverse relationship. And this is the main kind of a driving factor of the fish kill. So as the heat increases due to climate change, there's further water evaporation. And therefore, when you have more water evaporation, the base is heating up faster, and therefore we're starting to lose further and further oxygen. Lack of oxygen is then leading to fish kill and killing off the ecosystem that's already in water. So if we are only relying on much scattered very far, we're not able to understand the relationship of the discharges from the urban settlement, but also relationship of surfaces and other pollutants that are being distributed in this case, the bay. So when working in this scale, it's quite difficult to make general decisions that could directly lead to design. But what the goal here is to that over time and through accumulation of data, and by bringing in more people to engage in this conversation, we can begin to open up possibility of collaboration, but really understand that the decisions that we make, they have a larger impact. And another, I'm gonna wrap up the presentation with another line of research that I've been involved with for the past few years. In 2018, we were funded a grant by SOM Foundation to start to look at relationship of environmental parameters and high density. So this was under a grant called Humanizing High Density. And since then, with my colleague Chris Moon, we've been looking at a relationship of, in this case, understanding our senses and neurotechnology and environmental parameters. So if you are interested in the work application of neurotechnology and urban environmental parameters, I want to invite you to a presentation that we're going to be giving to conclude our research here. And if you're interested in again, neurotechnology and relationship of neuroscience and architecture, we do have about 3 years of research here, which we're looking at framing a problem of high density, humanizing high density through lens of neuroscience and role of data-driven workflows and also architectural thinking in this conversation. I'm not going to go into this since this is kind of complementary to the work, but it will kind of take us to a different tangent. But if you're interested in this conversation, I will be also happy to answer questions. But if you're interested, I do invite you to join this talk. So then we'll get into the detail of the technology for environmental sensing using neurotechnology, but also how that could lead to new standards and possibly policy change. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing, and then if there's any questions, I'll be happy to engage.
Thank you, Biayna, for your presentation. It was very clear, so we really appreciate your contribution to the ongoing discussion this semester on the relation between information systems and actually means to activate real-time problems in terms of information flows. In this program, one of the characteristics that we have been activating myself since, from a while ago, I have to say almost more than a decade, the relation between information systems and not only information systems, but information flows, right, as a way to think about reality in different terms. And what is the role of the architect in identifying information roles? One of the things that comes to my mind, because you're working with sensors, data sensing, which are issues that we also explore in this program, data acquisition, and then you call visualization. I always had problems with the word visualization. I'm glad that you mentioned information representation. I was one of the first ones to actually raise the issue of representation, although there is very clear, there's no much, if you want, problematization of the problem of representation in general in architecture related to information. One of the reasons is because architects do not really develop the technology through which they access reality. So one of the things that I appreciate about your presentation is the development of sensors, although then you go back to information visualization. So I just want to maybe ask you, on that relationship, how do you deal, for instance, one of the things that we raised in Acadia 2010, we raised the issue of authorship, right? Like, how do you deal with the, authorship has been problematized through many different, if you want, paradigms, different positions, and so on. I happen to have a very particular position on the issue of authorship relative to computations, but how do you deal with the information interface in terms, because what you call visualization, like for instance, if, and you're saying that you are the architect gathering the information and producing the visualization, but what would be the difference between an engineering or a technician doing what you do and you, if you can clarify that difference? So for instance, if you want to make it maybe more clear, like in 10 years from now, somebody else looks at the same problem, would the result change in relationship to the new technology available at that time? Or what would be the problematization on that relationship?
Yeah, I think that's a great, these are great comments. And I would like to start off actually commenting on what you mentioned in terms of visualization versus, well, maybe we can start even further back, the difference between data and information. I think that's maybe the first step. I think it's quite fascinating because we do start from data, but we're hoping that at some point that turns into information. And then in terms of visualization versus representation, I would like to think that my contribution, somebody who's trained as an architect or with even with a media arts PhD and background, that my contribution is in representation or representation. However, for the sake of these boxes that are already established within discipline, I noticed that when I would call my work information representation, still people were more comfortable calling it data viz, right? As kind of the short version of that. And at some point, I realized that maybe this is just based on the audience. It's based on maybe the hashtags. It's based on the kind of maybe the type of engagement that one wants to have. But I completely agree with that as an architect who is running right now a multidisciplinary lab. And actually a few minutes ago, while I was preparing for the presentation, we had the head of the kind of the Institute of Environment in this university. It's a very large university, and we're running the major water research and data research in the city. And he just walked in, and all of a sudden, you know, I had to put my hat of not really an architect, but somebody who's interested in fostering, you know, collaboration. Luckily, I'm in a place where they understand the contribution that we could have, but it's really fascinating. I feel like my role, at least here, has been very much trying to represent the same information in multiple different ways and start to then observe what is kind of maybe suitable or what is maybe more applicable to scientists versus the general public, and trying to merge that together. So I'm very much interested in this merging of the two worlds. At some point, sometimes I feel that maybe this is more of putting on different glasses, sometimes more catering towards the public, sometimes more towards the scientists. But over the years, I'm quite comfortable with the ambiguity that I could maybe start to present with our work. And I think that comes from our training in architecture, that we're often, you know, in between territories, and, you know, our field has very soft boundaries. And I think that could be our contribution to these conversations, that we could maybe be in the more technical territory, but we're able to zoom out and then talk about larger issues and then zoom back in and engage. And what you mentioned about hardware, obviously it's not an easy path to take years to learn, right? Begin to also know a little bit about everything, to begin to engage with, let's say, I'm advising electrical engineering students, and I need to make sure that they trust my knowledge for them to engage with me. So it's kind of not a typical way to maybe think about the role of an architect, but I think that's the fascinating thing about our field, that we are able to operate between territories and always think about the multiple scales at once. So I think that would be the difference between somebody with more technical background approaching this versus us beginning to engage with this with the hope that we can later on connect this to the built environment issues.
Thank you. And now I open to the students. I'm sure they have some comments or maybe questions. Anybody? Yes, no? Salma, you have a question? No. Like I said.
Thank you so much for the presentation and congratulations for the interesting projects that you showed us. I found it interesting, like the process of creating your own data set, because as we've seen in our program, like there is this problem of data bias when we're working with data, if we rely on the resources that are already existing. So I was wondering, in this process of making your own data, what are maybe some challenges that you face in the process, and how can you avoid them in order to create a data set that is more reliable?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So, and it's very exciting that, especially in the past few years, with let's say with certain documentaries like coded bias, etc., we're starting to really think about issue of bias. Now, there's this other kind of work that I do in the lab, which is dealing with information collection from people. So the biometric data collection. So that's the work that I briefly mentioned with the SRM Foundation. We're looking at information collection from people. So not so much from the environment, but how people respond using virtual reality and augmented reality. And within institution, there are a series of, let's say, a series of boundaries that we cannot cross, which I think these are great. But what is important is to also think about then who are the people that we're engaging with. So now, when we are, and there's a whole number of steps that you can take. So for instance, for some of the citizen science initiative, when we're inviting a community to engage with data collection, we need to make sure that we are, mindful of who we're inviting, who we're engaging. Or in terms of even the devices that we build, actually the Water One device, as you saw, it's basically a vertical element for collecting information. I have the pleasure of working with a wonderful researcher who is on wheelchair, and just by being able to, the pleasure of working with him, I'm aware of also different, different range of abilities, and the fact that maybe even the way that I'm thinking about the design of the box, it needs to be completely rethought. So once you start to really bring in the human factor, we really begin to understand that what we're putting forward as designer could have positive but negative effects. So we really need to be mindful of it. But in terms of environmental information, I want to highlight a few things. With the projects that I show in China, with the information collection that we were doing along at Tongji University, there's this history of governments that have been misreporting information. So China was one of them in terms of not recording the accurate pollution levels, right? So one of the things we did in 2017 was actually go to the city of Shanghai and do a comparative study. So what is being reported and what is being, what are we collecting? We did the same thing in city of in Mexico City. So I did not show that, but if you go to my website, you'll find out with students, we did a comparative study of what is being reported and what is being what are the actual reading. So when we're thinking about data and bias, we can think about it in terms of these borders and policies and lack of transparency that's set up. And then there's the human engagement aspect, right, which is manifold. And I'm really excited that you're asking this question, and this is actually something that's also being asked of the researchers that are engaging with this. So it's a great start.
So in Florida, that doesn't happen. In Florida, that doesn't happen.
In terms of misinformation.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, because you said in China and in Mexico, which is usually a bias, by the way. that to call out. You know, I find it interesting because I am sure in Florida also happens, right? Or not, or it doesn't happen.
Yeah, actually, well, that's another story. Actually, we just
I'm sorry
held
to put you in an uncomfortable
No,
situation.
no,
I just think
I'm
that we need to, from a university point of view, we need to have a certain accountability in terms of the system of measurement. What's happening now with COVID is unbelievable, right? Like the system of measurement changes in relationship to the policy of the time, of the week, by the way, right? So I just wonder if you have if you feel comfortable, you don't have to worry about it.
100%. I just want to be mindful of time. Do we still have time to continue?
Yeah, yes, no, just I want to poke on that because usually when we and especially in lectures that are international audience, when we call from the US, we have international audience have the sense that of authority from us, and I think that we have the lack of authority nowadays in many senses, right? From the scientific to any other level. So I just want to clarify for our audience, if you want to clarify what you mean or not. Otherwise, you don't have to.
100%. So I'm actually, that's kind of the activist part of my work, which I'm happy that, you know, I would love to talk more about. So if I may kind of do a comparison. So remember when I was talking about the University of Southern California and the highest polluted corner, right? So once we conducted the experiment, I had an opportunity to present this to the provost. What the idea was to, they were very near providing the funding for us to create an interactive lamp. Actually, not really the existing traffic light, but an interactive lamp near that corner to actually, based on the pollution level, project a pattern on the ground and change color. So this was very exciting. We were really near kind of finalizing this at the end. Somebody from Provost mentioned that, well, this is great, but what if this is not reporting the right color when we have parents that are paying a lot of tuition visiting campus, right? So the entire effort, then all the data collection and everything was put to stop because there was this worry about, you know, parents, looking at the campus as a polluted area. So obviously that made me want to, you know, publish and talk about that. So my goal is, I'm really near finishing next year. I'm planning an exhibition where I can actually highlight these issues in the university. Same thing with, Shanghai. We did a comparative study. What's interesting about the difference between what we observed in Korea, in China, in Korea versus Mexico City, and then I'll talk about Florida. So in China, there was many years of kind of hiding the information. And then there was this underground website called AQICN, which started to report weather information. And it became a really popular website, and it's quite actually friendly if you want to work with the API. In a sense, there was never kind of acknowledgement of misreporting, but then there was this underground effort to do that. But what's fascinating about Mexico City is the Mexico City kind of embraced this. I don't know if you visited, so I did the workshop in 2017, and that was the year where the city had launched a lot of effort into marketing a new website for the city. So pink and white and really like beautiful marketing. And they had kind of new way information was not hidden. It was very easy. It's the easiest city for us to find actually pollution information. So my general understanding and conversation was that they were kind of saying, well, this is what it is, but we're putting it out there. And this was around the time where, you know, the Open Data Act was passing. So it was a very interesting change in attitude. And then if you look at the Korea, you know, for many years blaming China for the pollution, but obviously these borders, you know, you cannot build a wall tall enough for it to maybe stop the pollutants coming in. After a while, you know, the mayor had to do something about it, which gave us that small window of opportunity to say, hey, can we collaborate with the city and can we get the data? Now, Florida is an interesting place because it's always kind of the problematic state where could move one way or the other. Usually it moves the other way. So it's an interesting place to talk about sustainability issues, not in the university. I have extreme support, and the amount of funding and support is quite incredible. But we just had a conference here for ARCC EAAE, which was focused on resilient cities. And we had the chief resiliency officer of the city as kind of the opening keynote. And it was not very exciting, because what we heard was actually the fact that, well, we're doing fine because 10 years ago, we were not able to even mention sustainability. And, you know, we've made improvements because at least now we can mention sustainability. So the state is not, let's say, data friendly, environmentally, let's say, focused, but, you know, what it takes is efforts to mobilize, right? And after a while, then you cannot really shut down these efforts. So let's say that it's a state where there's kind of collective support, there's institutional support, but it's not the same as, let's say, working in California, where there's more open data. Now, you're in New York City, and New York City is the city with the most amount of GIS data or open data, right? So it's very different working in New York City than anywhere else. So it's still not, let's say, even if you're working with OpenStreetMap in Miami, we don't have all the layers here, versus in New York City, you have more layers because there's more people contributing to that conversation.
Well, you know, in a way, there is like different levels of the conversation, because even if in an ideal situation, imagine you get access to all the information that you wish for, there's still going to be the layer of ideology, right? In terms of, and the issue of non-biased data doesn't really exist. That's what I wrote back in 2010. And I think I got into trouble with a lot of architects, because I think that the common understanding is that that you're supposed to get rid of data bias, and by those means you're going to access reality. That doesn't exist to me, from my point of view. There's no objective reality outside ideology, and the problem in the US in general is that the ideology is coming from an economic system that is always going to push for a conflict of interest in relationship to, for instance, environmental issues. So no matter what we do, no matter how you get rid of the bias, eventually, imagine if you have all the data that you need, all the conditions that you need, you're still going to be addressing the issue from, I think, from a problematic point of view, and that's to me one of the political dimensions that we are trying to fight against. That is not only because you need a cultural bias, by the way, because otherwise you don't have culture, right? So we have to be aware of that, and I think that that's one of the problems of certain scientific methods, that they exclude, for instance, the group that composes the data, right? As if there's no bias. Like, for instance, now there is a deconstruction about the entire biology field of study, because gender was not considered, but all of a sudden, when there is a woman doing research, there's more discoveries about female, right, animals, right, which were totally avoided before. So in a way, like, you both need it, but you also need to understand the bias, but you also have to engage with cultural point of view, right? Because otherwise, those cultural voices will be excluded. But you know, it's an interesting problem and an interesting conversation, and I appreciate that. I don't know if Youssef and Farah and Kavya, you have any questions. Otherwise, we can resume now. But you know, this issue of the relation between data and information is an interesting subject of study. I've been working on it for many years, and still I find it interesting that people think that they can access data objectively. And my argument is that there's not that case. It's an impossibility. And I think until we come into terms with that, there is an architectural gap, right, in terms of the work that we do as architects in acknowledging how we work with information systems. But the students, do you have any reaction, any comment? No, we're okay. Otherwise, we can complete here. Youssef, you're about to say something? No.
No, I was just gonna say that. I'm just gonna thank her again for coming, and for I really appreciate the way you're representing the data. It's very, very interesting. Like, everything is very interesting, and the way you incorporate virtual reality. that's something we've never seen so far. So
yes, that's the reason why
Yes.
I wanted Biayna to come to us, because there's something, I mean, we have been working with, but we didn't really activate so much of it. So I was happy to invite you to talk to us about the real-time interaction with data, basically, right?
Yeah, it's quite tricky, actually. The mechanism, the software is not designed for that. Like, if you want to, yeah, its challenges are quite fascinating, because you know, right now, let's say if you're using Unity to import coordinates, right? So what is longitude, latitude, altitude to a Euclidean environment, where you're still then constrained by the kind of limited point of view of virtual reality, or let's say HoloLens's tiny view, right? So we need to then go through many layers of translation and scaling to then go from what maybe the real-time feed would be to what would be then communicated to the public. So I think that's why, again, we still have quite a lot to contribute as a field who is comfortable with thinking in a more kind of socio-spatial way. Ultimately, architecture, I believe, at least, is a cultural practice. So hopefully we can inject this aspect into this nuanced but still very new field of working with data, whether it's real time or whether it's archival. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, Biayna, for joining us, and hope to count with you in another opportunity. And thank you so much. Congratulations for the great work that you're doing there in Florida. Hopefully you take it to the next level.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Have a great